You don't belong here. The words cut through the courtroom air like they had been said 100 times before, casual, careless, and loud enough for everyone to hear. Officer Daniel Brooks leaned back in his chair, a crooked smile spreading across his face as his laughter followed, low at first, then louder, feeding off the silence around him. The woman he was looking at didn't react. She sat still, composed, her posture straight, hands resting calmly in her lap as if none of it touched her. But it did. You could feel it in the room, the tension tightening like a wire pulled too far. Imagine standing there, surrounded by polished wood, cold fluorescent lights humming overhead, every pair of eyes watching, waiting, judging, and hearing someone decide, out loud, that you didn't belong. Brooks tilted his head, studying her like she was out of place, like she had wandered into a space reserved for someone else. Court's not a place for spectators who don't understand how things work, he added, his tone dripping with condescension. A few quiet chuckles slipped through the room, nervous, uncertain, but enough to encourage him. He thrived in moments like this, where his badge filled the space before he even had to speak. 17 years on the force had taught him one thing: confidence could drown out doubt, and authority, if worn loud enough, rarely got questioned. Across from him, the woman, Ava Reynolds, did nothing. No protest. No shift in her expression. Just a slow, steady breath, like she had all the time in the world. Her eyes lifted, meeting his for just a second, and there was something there. Not fear. Not anger. Something quieter. Something heavier. Then she looked down again, her fingers brushing lightly against the thick case file resting beside her. The name printed across the front was partially visible, but no one seemed to notice. Not yet. The courtroom itself felt like it was holding its breath. Papers shuffled softly. A clock ticked somewhere on the wall, each second stretching longer than it should. Brooks leaned forward now, elbows on his knees, his voice dropping just enough to sound personal, deliberate. "You hear me?" he said louder this time, making sure there was no mistaking who he was talking to. "This isn't your place." And still, she didn't respond. That was the part that unsettled him, though he'd never admit it. Most people pushed back. Most people reacted. But silence like that, it didn't give him anything to grab onto. It just sat there, waiting. And he hated waiting. So he laughed again, louder now, filling the room, turning away like the moment was already over, like he had already won. But what Daniel Brooks didn't know, what no one in that room realized yet, was that the woman he had just dismissed with a laugh wasn't just sitting there by chance. She wasn't lost. She wasn't confused. And she definitely wasn't out of place. She was exactly where she was supposed to be. And in less than a minute, the entire room was about to understand why. The air did not move, but something in the room had shifted, subtle and almost invisible, like the moment before a storm breaks. Ava Reynolds remained seated, her gaze lowered just enough to appear disengaged, yet every detail around her was being measured, noted, understood. The faint buzz of the fluorescent lights above blended with the soft shuffle of legal papers, creating a rhythm that most people ignored but she did not. She had spent years in rooms like this, where power was not always loud, where the most dangerous decisions were made in silence. Across the aisle, a junior attorney leaned toward another and whispered something under his breath, his eyes flicking toward Ava with a trace of uncertainty, as if a memory was trying to surface but had not yet found its way. Near the back, a court clerk paused mid-step, her hand tightening slightly around a stack of documents, her attention lingering just a second longer than necessary. These were small things, easy to miss, but they were there, like cracks forming beneath a polished surface. Daniel Brooks did not notice any of it. He stood up now, stretching his shoulders as if the entire room belonged to him, his confidence expanding to fill every corner. "Let us keep this moving," he said, his voice steady and firm, the tone of someone used to being obeyed. He did not look at Ava again, not directly, because in his mind, there was nothing left to look at. The moment had passed. The point had been made. Or so he believed. Ava's fingers rested lightly on the edge of the case file beside her, the paper cooled beneath her touch. The name printed across the front was no longer hidden, though no one had spoken it yet. Daniel Brooks. The letters sat there, plain and undeniable, tied to every report, every statement, every decision that had led to this room. She traced the edge of the page once, slowly, as if confirming something already known. Her breathing remained steady, her posture unchanged, but there was a quiet gravity surrounding her now, something that did not demand attention yet could not be ignored forever. A man seated 2 rows behind Brooks shifted in his chair, his expression tightening as his eyes moved from Ava to the file and back again. Recognition flickered, uncertain at first, then sharper, more defined. He leaned forward slightly, as if about to speak, then stopped himself, the hesitation clear in the way his hands gripped the bench in front of him. Time stretched. Seconds felt longer than they should. The clock on the wall ticked again, louder this time, or maybe it just felt that way. Brooks stepped toward the center of the room, adjusting his uniform with a practiced motion, his presence commanding, his certainty unshaken. "We all know how this works," he continued, addressing the room without realizing how many eyes were no longer on him. "Facts are facts." The words hung there, confident, final. And still, Ava said nothing. Because she did not need to. Not yet. The truth was already in the room. It was sitting in plain sight, waiting for the exact moment to be seen. And that moment was getting closer with every passing second. The tension no longer hid beneath the surface, it began to move, slow and deliberate, like a ripple spreading through still water. Ava Reynolds lifted her eyes again, not toward Daniel Brooks this time, but toward the bench at the front of the courtroom, the place where authority was supposed to sit, where decisions shaped lives with the quiet strike of a gavel. It was still empty. That was the detail no one questioned, not yet, because routines made people comfortable, and comfort made them blind. A soft murmur passed between 2 clerks near the side wall, their voices low but urgent, one of them glancing down at a printed docket, then back at Ava, then back again as if trying to reconcile something that did not fit. The name on that docket had been there all morning. It had not changed. Only their understanding of it had. Daniel Brooks continued speaking, his voice steady, controlled, filling the space like he had done countless times before, but there was a slight delay now in how the room responded. Fewer nods. Fewer affirmations. Something subtle had slipped, and though he could not see it, he could feel it in the way the air no longer carried his words the same way. Ava shifted her hand slightly, turning the case file just enough so that the full name faced outward, no longer hidden by the curve of her arm. Daniel Brooks. It sat there plainly, not just as a label, but as a weight, a record of every decision that had led him into this room without him realizing what this room truly was. A man seated near the aisle cleared his throat, louder than necessary, drawing a few glances. His eyes moved from the file to Ava, then to the empty bench, and something clicked into place behind his expression. He straightened in his seat, his posture tightening as if instinct was telling him to prepare for something that had not yet been spoken. The clock ticked again. 10 seconds. Then another. Time did not rush. It never did in moments like this. It stretched, forcing everyone to sit inside it, to feel it build. Brooks finally paused, just for a moment, his sentence cutting off mid-thought as he sensed the shift he could not explain. His eyes scanned the room, quick, searching for the source of the distraction, the break in rhythm. "Is there a problem?" he asked, his tone firm but edged now with something else, something thinner than confidence. No one answered. Because no one needed to. The answer was already standing in plain sight. Ava rose slowly to her feet, not with urgency, not with hesitation, but with the kind of control that comes from knowing exactly when the moment belongs to you. The sound of her chair moving back was quiet, but it cut through the room sharper than anything Brooks had said all morning. Several people stood instinctively, not because they were told to, but because something in them recognized what he still did not. Ava did not rush. She did not look around for approval. She simply stood, the file in her hand now, her presence expanding into the space that had once tried to shrink her. Brooks turned toward her, confusion tightening his expression as the pieces began to move too fast for him to stop them. He opened his mouth, ready to speak again, ready to reassert control, but the words did not come out the same. Because for the first time since he walked into that courtroom, he was no longer the one setting the tone. And he was about to understand why. The moment did not explode, it unfolded, slow and undeniable, like a truth that had been waiting too long to be heard. Ava Reynolds stood fully now, the case file held at her side, her posture steady, her presence no longer something that could be overlooked or dismissed. The quiet movement of her rising seemed to pull the entire room upward with her, chairs shifting, bodies straightening, a silent wave of recognition passing through those who were beginning to understand. Daniel Brooks did not move at first. He watched her, confusion tightening his jaw, his mind searching for control in a situation that no longer responded to him. "Sit down," he said, the words coming out sharper than he intended, louder than they should have been in a room that had suddenly grown very still. But the command did not land the way it once would have. No one echoed it. No one moved to enforce it. Instead, the stillness deepened. Ava turned her head slightly, her gaze settling on him with calm precision, not challenging, not emotional, just certain. It was the kind of look that did not argue, because it did not need to. Behind him, a clerk stepped forward, her voice clear but measured, carrying across the room without force. "All rise." The words were simple, routine even, but in that moment, they carried a weight that changed everything. Chairs scraped softly against the floor as people stood, not out of confusion now, but out of understanding. Brooks felt it before he processed it, the shift in energy, the sudden alignment of everyone in the room toward a single point that was no longer him. He turned halfway, his eyes scanning the faces around him, searching for something familiar, something to anchor himself to, but all he found were expressions that had already moved past him. The clerk continued, her tone unwavering. "For Federal Judge Ava Reynolds." The name settled into the room like a final piece falling into place. No echo. No repetition. It did not need one. Brooks turned back slowly, the movement stiff, his earlier confidence unraveling not in a dramatic collapse, but in something quieter, more unsettling. His eyes met hers again, but this time there was no distance between what he saw and what he understood. The woman he had dismissed, the woman he had laughed at, was now standing exactly where she had always belonged, and the authority he thought he carried had never been enough to challenge it. Ava did not raise her voice. She did not need to claim the room. It had already shifted to her. She stepped forward, one measured step, then another, the sound of her shoes against the polished floor steady and controlled. Every movement was deliberate, every second stretched just enough for the realization to settle into every corner of the courtroom. Brooks opened his mouth again, but whatever words he had prepared no longer fit the moment. They dissolved before they could take shape. Ava stopped a few feet from him, her gaze level, her expression unchanged, but now there was something else behind it, something that had been there from the beginning, waiting. Not anger. Not satisfaction. Just truth. And in that silence, with every eye in the room fixed on them, it became clear that this was no longer his stage. It never had been. And the case he thought he was walking through with control was already in her hands. The room remained standing, but the balance of power had already shifted in a way that could not be undone. Ava Reynolds moved past Daniel Brooks without brushing against him, without even needing to acknowledge his presence physically, yet the distance between them felt wider than the entire courtroom. She stepped toward the bench with calm authority, each movement measured, unhurried, as if time itself had adjusted to her pace. The soft sound of her footsteps echoed in the silence, not loud, but impossible to ignore. Brooks stood where he was, his body rigid, his hands no longer resting with confidence but hanging uncertainly at his sides. For the first time in years, he did not know where to place them, did not know what gesture would restore the control he thought he had. His eyes followed her, searching for something familiar, some sign that this was still a misunderstanding he could correct, but there was none. Ava reached the bench and placed the case file down gently, aligning it with precision, as if even the smallest detail mattered. Because it did. Everything did. She turned, facing the courtroom now, and only then did she speak. Her voice was not raised, not dramatic, but it carried with it a clarity that cut through every corner of the room. "You may be seated." The words were simple, expected even, but when they came from her, they carried a weight that settled over everyone at once. Chairs moved again, people sitting carefully, almost cautiously, as if aware that they were now part of something far more serious than they had anticipated. Brooks hesitated before sitting, a fraction of a second too long, and in that hesitation, his uncertainty became visible to everyone. Ava's gaze moved across the room briefly, acknowledging the presence of each person without lingering, before it returned to the file in front of her. She opened it slowly, the sound of paper shifting in the quiet room sounding louder than it should have. Daniel Brooks. The name was no longer just ink on a page. It was the center of everything unfolding in that moment. She did not rush through the contents. She did not need to. Every page had already been reviewed, every detail already understood. What mattered now was not discovery. It was confirmation. Brooks swallowed, the motion subtle but unmistakable, his throat suddenly dry as he realized that every word he had spoken earlier, every glance, every assumption, had not disappeared into the air. They had landed. They had been seen. And now they existed in a space where they could not be ignored or dismissed. Ava's eyes lifted from the file, meeting his once more, and this time there was no ambiguity left in the exchange. She was not the person he had judged minutes ago. She was the authority that would evaluate everything he had done, everything he had said, and everything he had chosen to overlook. The silence stretched again, but it was no longer empty. It was full, heavy with the understanding that the roles in this room had been reversed completely. Brooks shifted slightly in his seat, the movement small, but it carried the weight of someone realizing that the ground beneath him was no longer stable. And Ava, seated firmly at the center of that room, held the one thing he no longer could control. Ava Reynolds did not rush the moment, because she understood something Daniel Brooks was only beginning to feel, that time inside a courtroom does not belong to the loudest voice, it belongs to the one who controls when truth is spoken. Her fingers turned the first page of the file with quiet precision, the soft sound of paper echoing just enough to draw every ounce of attention back to her. The room had settled into a new rhythm now, one where no one interrupted, no one whispered, no one dared to fill the silence she allowed to exist. Brooks sat straighter than before, but it was not confidence that held his posture, it was tension, the kind that builds when someone realizes they are being seen in a way they cannot control. Ava's eyes moved across the page, not scanning, not searching, but confirming, each line already familiar, each detail already weighed long before he ever walked into that room. She paused for a moment, just long enough for the weight of that pause to be felt, then lifted her gaze toward him again. "Officer Brooks," she said, her voice steady, neutral, yet carrying an authority that required no emphasis. Hearing his name spoken like that, without sarcasm, without hesitation, landed differently than anything he had heard before. It was not an introduction. It was recognition. And recognition meant accountability. Brooks nodded slightly, an automatic response, though he did not trust his voice enough to answer immediately. His mind was moving quickly now, replaying the last 10 minutes, every word he had spoken, every look he had given, every assumption he had made without thinking twice. Ava continued, not raising her voice, not rushing her words, allowing each one to settle exactly where it needed to. "You have been called here as part of a review," she said, her tone measured, factual, as if the process itself mattered more than any individual in the room. "A review that examines not only actions but judgment." The last word lingered slightly longer, not emphasized, but impossible to ignore. Brooks felt his chest tighten, just enough to shift his breathing, just enough to make him aware that this was no longer a routine appearance, no longer something he could navigate with the same confidence he had relied on for years. Ava's hand rested lightly on the file again, her fingers still, grounded, as if anchoring the entire room to the truth contained within those pages. "This court," she continued, her eyes steady on him. Does not operate on assumption. The sentence was simple, but it carried a quiet weight that pressed into the silence around it. Brooks lowered his gaze for a brief moment, not out of submission, but because holding eye contact suddenly required more than he had expected. Around him, the room remained still, attentive, no longer reacting to him, no longer following his lead. Ava closed the file halfway, not fully, leaving it open just enough to show that the process was still unfolding, that nothing had been decided yet, but everything was already in motion. The balance had shifted completely now, not through force, not through confrontation, but through something far more powerful. Clarity. And as Brooks sat there, feeling that clarity settle over him, he began to understand that this was not about one moment, not about one mistake, but about something much larger that had been building long before he ever noticed it. And now, there was no way to step outside of it. The silence that followed did not feel empty anymore. It felt deliberate, as if every second was being placed carefully into position by someone who understood exactly how much it mattered. Ava Reynolds did not look down at the file this time. She kept her gaze on Daniel Brooks, steady and unwavering, allowing the weight of what had already been said to settle deeper before adding anything more. In that stillness, the smallest movements became visible. A shift in posture. A tightening of hands. The subtle rise and fall of breath that could no longer stay controlled. Brooks felt it all, not just within himself, but around him, the awareness that the room was no longer a place he could dominate with presence alone. Judgment, Ava repeated quietly, the word returning like an echo, but now it carried a sharper edge, not in tone, but in meaning. She let it sit there, not explaining it, not softening it, because it did not need either. Brooks swallowed again, this time slower, his eyes lifting to meet hers as if trying to regain something that had already slipped beyond reach. Yes, Your Honor, he said, the title leaving his mouth with a formality that felt unfamiliar in this context, as if he was adjusting to a reality that had changed too quickly for him to keep up. Ava gave a small nod, acknowledging the response, but not reacting to it. Her focus remained on the substance of what was unfolding, not the surface. In your report, she continued, her voice even, controlled, you describe your actions as routine. The word routine lingered, simple but heavy, as if it carried layers beneath it that had yet to be fully revealed. Brooks nodded once, more firmly this time, finding something he could hold on to. Yes, Your Honor. Standard procedure. His voice was steady, but there was a slight tightness behind it now, something that had not been there earlier. Ava listened without interruption, her expression unchanged, her posture composed. Then she turned the page slowly, the movement deliberate, revealing another section of the file. And yet, she said, her tone shifting just enough to signal that something important was about to be placed into the open. Multiple accounts describe a different experience. The room seemed to narrow in that moment, not physically, but in focus, every person present drawn into the space between those words. Brooks felt the shift immediately. His shoulders squared slightly, instinctively, as if preparing to respond, to clarify, to defend. There are often misunderstandings, he said, choosing his words carefully, aware now that each one carried more weight than before. Ava did not interrupt him. She allowed the sentence to finish, to exist fully in the room before she responded. Misunderstandings, she repeated, not questioning the word but examining it, holding it up as if it needed to be seen clearly from every angle. Her eyes remained on him, calm, but unyielding. Tell me, Officer Brooks, she continued, leaning forward just slightly, not aggressively, but with intent. How often do misunderstandings occur when assumptions are made before facts are confirmed? The question did not come with accusation. It came with precision. And that made it harder to answer. Brooks opened his mouth, then paused, just for a second, because the answer he would have given earlier no longer fit as easily into this moment. Around him, the room remained completely still, no distractions, no interruptions, only the quiet pressure of truth beginning to take shape. And in that pressure, something began to shift inside him, not fully formed yet, not fully accepted, but present. The realization that this was no longer about what he intended, but about what had been seen, recorded, and understood. And for the first time, that difference mattered. The question did not demand an immediate answer, and that was what made it so difficult to escape. It lingered in the air, steady and precise, forcing Daniel Brooks to sit with it longer than he was used to. In most rooms, questions like that could be redirected, softened, or answered with confidence alone. But this was not most rooms anymore. Ava Reynolds did not rush him. She did not repeat herself. She simply waited, her gaze steady, her posture unchanged, giving the silence space to do what it always eventually does, reveal what words try to hide. Brooks shifted slightly in his seat, his hands coming together for a brief moment before separating again, as if he had not yet decided what to do with them. His mind searched for a response that sounded strong, controlled, consistent with everything he had presented so far. Assumptions can happen in fast situations, he said finally, his voice measured, careful, trying to regain footing. But they are part of making quick decisions. The words landed, but not with the certainty he intended. Ava listened without interruption, her expression neither approving nor dismissive. She allowed the statement to exist fully before responding, as if placing it alongside everything else already in the room. Quick decisions, she repeated, her tone neutral, but the repetition itself carried weight, as if inviting the room to examine the phrase more closely. She leaned back slightly, not disengaging, but creating a different kind of space, one that widened the scope of what was being considered. And in those decisions, she continued, what role does perception play? The question came gently, almost quietly, but it reached further than the one before it. Brooks hesitated again, just for a fraction of a second, but enough for it to be noticed. Perception helps assess the situation, he answered, choosing each word with care. Ava nodded once, acknowledging the response, but her eyes did not leave him. Perception, she said again, the word now taking on a new layer, can be influenced. She did not raise her voice. She did not need to. The simplicity of the statement was enough. Around them, the room remained completely still, every person aware that something deeper was being uncovered, not through accusation, but through clarity. Ava reached for the file again, turning another page, revealing a section marked with multiple statements, each one a perspective, each one a piece of a larger picture. She did not read them aloud. She did not need to. These accounts, she said, her voice calm, steady, describe a pattern. The word pattern settled heavily, not dramatic, but undeniable. Brooks felt it immediately, the shift from a single moment to something broader, something that could not be explained away as easily. His jaw tightened slightly, his eyes lowering for a brief second before lifting again, as if he was trying to hold on to control that was slowly slipping away. Patterns, Ava continued, her gaze still on him, are not formed by one moment. They are formed by repetition. The sentence was quiet, but it carried a clarity that filled the room. Brooks did not respond this time, not immediately. Because for the first time, the conversation had moved beyond what he could easily defend. It was no longer about what happened once. It was about what had happened more than once. And in that realization, the space around him felt different, narrower, more defined, leaving less room for explanation and more room for truth to take its place. The word pattern did not fade after it was spoken, it settled into the room, anchoring itself in a way that made everything else feel secondary. Ava Reynolds allowed the silence to stretch again, not out of hesitation, but with intention, giving Daniel Brooks time to fully understand what had just been placed before him. This was no longer about a single moment that could be explained away or reframed. This was about something that had repeated, something that had been noticed, documented, and now, presented in a space where it could not be ignored. Brooks shifted in his seat again, his shoulders tightening as the weight of that realization pressed in. He glanced briefly at the file in front of her, then back at her face, as if trying to measure how much she already knew. The answer was clear in her composure. She knew enough. Ava's fingers rested lightly on the page, not turning it yet, as if holding the moment in place. When patterns appear, she said quietly, her voice calm but precise. They invite a different kind of question. She paused just long enough for the sentence to settle, her gaze steady on him. Not what happened, but why it continues to happen. The shift in focus was subtle, but it changed everything. Brooks inhaled slowly, his chest rising as he tried to organize his thoughts into something that still felt controlled. I have followed procedure, he said, his voice firmer now, holding on to the structure that had always guided him. Every action I have taken has been within the guidelines I was trained to follow. The statement sounded solid, practiced, something he had relied on before. Ava nodded slightly, acknowledging the response without interrupting. Procedure, she repeated, her tone neutral, examining the word rather than challenging it. She leaned forward just a fraction, her presence drawing the room's focus even tighter. Procedure defines what is allowed, she continued, but it does not always define what is understood. The distinction was quiet, but it carried weight. Brooks felt it immediately, the difference between following rules and interpreting situations. Ava turned the page then, slowly, revealing a section marked with notes, observations that had been gathered over time. She did not read them aloud. She did not need to. The implication was enough. Understanding, she said, her voice steady, requires awareness beyond the surface. The words were not directed at him alone, but they landed with precision. Brooks held her gaze this time, longer than before, as if trying to steady himself against what was unfolding. Are you suggesting that my judgment has been compromised? He asked, the question measured, but carrying a hint of tension that had not been there earlier. Ava did not react to the tone. She did not mirror it. Instead, she let the question exist fully before responding. I am suggesting, she said calmly, that judgment is most accurate when it is examined, not assumed. The room remained completely still, every person aware that the conversation had moved beyond simple answers. Brooks leaned back slightly, his posture adjusting, not relaxed, but recalibrating, as if he was trying to find new footing in a space that no longer responded to the old one. Ava closed the file halfway again, not ending the review, but signaling a pause, a moment to absorb what had already been placed into the open. The silence returned, but it was no longer passive. It was active, shaping the space, defining the direction of what would come next. And in that silence, it became clear that this was not a confrontation. It was something more precise. A process. One that did not rush, did not react, but moved forward with quiet certainty, step by step, until there was nothing left to question, and nothing left to hide. The silence that followed was no longer something that needed to be managed, it had become part of the structure of the room itself, holding everything in place while the truth continued to surface piece by piece. Ava Reynolds rested her hand lightly on the file again, her fingers still, grounded, as if she understood that what came next would not need to be loud to be undeniable. Daniel Brooks sat across from her, his posture firm but no longer steady, the small adjustments in his shoulders and hands revealing what his voice was trying to conceal. He had answered questions before, had stood in rooms where authority protected him, where procedure gave him a clear path forward. But this was different. This was not about defending actions in isolation. This was about understanding them in context. Ava lifted her gaze, her eyes steady, focused not on his reaction, but on the truth that had already begun to take shape. Let us consider something simple, she said, her tone even, measured, inviting the room into the next step without forcing it. When a decision is made, and that decision is repeated under similar conditions, it begins to define more than just an action. She paused briefly, allowing the idea to settle, her voice never rising, never pushing, just placing each word where it needed to be. It begins to define a standard. The word standard landed with quiet weight, shifting the frame of everything that had been discussed so far. Brooks felt it immediately, the movement from individual moments to something broader, something that reflected not just what he did, but how he consistently chose to do it. He straightened slightly, his chin lifting just enough to hold on to some sense of control. I have maintained standards, he said, his voice steady, though the firmness in it now carried a trace of strain. That is part of my responsibility. Ava nodded once, acknowledging the statement without interrupting its place in the conversation. Responsibility, she repeated, her tone calm, examining the word, rather than challenging it. She leaned forward slightly, just enough to narrow the space between them, not physically, but in focus. Includes the ability to recognize when a standard is not serving its intended purpose. The distinction was subtle, but it shifted the ground beneath the conversation again. Brooks held her gaze longer this time, as if trying to stabilize himself within the moment. And what purpose do you believe is not being served? He asked, the question controlled, but carrying an edge that had not been present before. Ava did not react to the shift in tone. She did not mirror it. Instead, she allowed the question to exist fully before responding. The purpose of fairness, she said quietly. The words were simple, but they carried a clarity that filled the room more completely than anything spoken before. No one moved. No one spoke. The concept itself did not need explanation. It was understood. Ava's hand moved to the file again, opening it slightly wider this time, revealing more of its contents, more of the documented observations that had been gathered over time. Fairness, she continued, her voice steady, requires consistency, but it also requires awareness of difference. Brooks felt the shift again, deeper this time, the narrowing of space around him, the realization that this was no longer a conversation he could guide. It was a process unfolding in front of him, one that did not rely on his interpretation, but on what had already been recorded. He leaned back slightly, the movement small, but it carried the weight of someone beginning to understand that control, once lost, does not return easily. And across from him, Ava Reynolds remained composed, grounded, holding the one thing that now defined the entire room. The ability to see clearly, and to ensure that clarity could no longer be ignored. The word fairness did not fade after it was spoken, it settled into the room with a quiet finality, as if everything that had come before had been leading to that single point. Ava Reynolds did not look away, did not shift her posture, did not soften the space she now fully held. She allowed the silence to stretch again, not to create tension, but to let understanding take root. Daniel Brooks felt it settle over him, not like pressure from the outside, but like something internal beginning to shift, something he could no longer ignore or explain away. He kept his gaze forward, but it was no longer steady in the same way. There was thought behind it now, calculation, reflection, the slow realization that the ground beneath his certainty had changed. Ava turned another page in the file, the motion calm, deliberate, revealing a section marked with internal notes, timestamps, and observations gathered across different moments. She did not read them aloud. She did not need to. Their presence alone spoke to something larger than a single event. When consistency appears, she said quietly, her voice even, controlled, it creates expectation. The sentence was simple, but it carried weight, shifting the focus again, not just to what had happened, but to what others had come to anticipate. Brooks exhaled slowly, the breath measured, as if trying to steady himself within the moment. Expectation of what? He asked, his voice controlled, but softer now, less certain than before. Ava lifted her eyes to meet his, her gaze steady, unwavering. Expectation of outcome, she replied. The clarity in her voice left no room for misinterpretation. The room remained completely still, every person present aware that something irreversible had been placed into the open. Ava's hand rested lightly on the file again, anchoring the moment. When individuals begin to expect a certain outcome, she continued, based on repeated interactions, it reflects not only on the situation, but on the one making the decisions. Brooks felt the shift deepen, the narrowing of space around him becoming more defined, more focused. He leaned forward slightly, his hands coming together, not in confidence, but in concentration, as if he was trying to understand where this was leading before it arrived. Are you saying that perception of me has changed? He asked, the question measured, but carrying something new, not just defense, but uncertainty. Ava did not hesitate. I am saying that perception is formed over time, she answered calmly. And once formed, It influences how every action is understood. The distinction was quiet, but it carried weight that settled across the room. Brooks lowered his gaze briefly, not out of avoidance, but because holding eye contact now required something different, something heavier. Around him, the room remained focused, attentive, no longer reacting, only observing. Ava closed the file gently, not ending the process, but marking a transition, a point where understanding had been established. This review, she said, her voice steady, is not only about what has occurred. It is about what has been allowed to continue. The words settled into the silence with clarity, not harsh, not dramatic, but undeniable. Brooks sat back slowly, the movement controlled, but it carried the weight of someone beginning to see the full shape of what he was facing. This was no longer about explaining actions. It was about confronting their meaning. And across from him, Ava Reynolds remained composed, grounded in something he could no longer challenge. Not authority alone, but truth, clear, steady, and impossible to ignore. The room did not shift anymore because it had already settled into its final shape, a space where nothing unnecessary remained, only truth and the quiet weight of what came with it. Ava Reynolds rested her hands lightly on the closed file, her posture composed, her presence steady, as if everything that needed to be revealed had already been placed exactly where it belonged. She did not rush to speak again. She did not need to. The silence now was not something waiting to be filled. It was something that confirmed what had already been understood. Daniel Brooks sat across from her, no longer searching the room for support, no longer measuring reactions, because there were none to measure. Every person present had moved beyond reaction. They were witnessing. And in that witnessing, there was no space left for performance. Ava's gaze lifted once more, meeting his directly, not with confrontation, but with clarity that no longer needed explanation. "There is a difference," she said quietly, her voice even, grounded, "between authority and understanding." The words were simple, but they carried a depth that reached further than anything spoken before. Brooks did not respond immediately. He could not. Because the statement did not challenge him in the way he was used to being challenged. It did not accuse. It revealed. Ava continued, her tone steady, each word placed with precision. "Authority can act," she said, "but understanding must reflect." The distinction settled into the space between them, filling it completely. Brooks lowered his gaze for a moment, not in avoidance, but in recognition, as if something he had not considered before was now impossible to ignore. Ava did not press him. She allowed that moment to exist fully, because it mattered. When she spoke again, her voice remained calm, but there was a quiet finality within it. "This review is not about removing authority," she said. "It is about ensuring that authority serves the purpose it was given." The room remained completely still, every person aware that what was being said now extended beyond one individual, beyond one case, into something larger, something foundational. Brooks inhaled slowly, the breath deeper this time, as if he was grounding himself in a reality that had shifted beyond his control. His hands rested still now, no longer searching for movement, no longer trying to hold on to something that was no longer there. Ava's fingers tapped lightly against the closed file, not out of impatience, but as a quiet marker of transition. "What has been presented here," she continued, "is not a single moment to be judged in isolation. It is a series of moments that form a clearer picture." The word picture lingered, not abstract, but precise, something that could now be seen, understood, and no longer ignored. Brooks lifted his eyes again, meeting hers, and this time there was no attempt to reclaim control, no attempt to redirect the conversation. Only awareness. Ava held that gaze for a second longer, then gave a small, almost imperceptible nod, not as approval, but as acknowledgement that the process had reached the point it needed to reach. The truth had been placed into the open. The understanding had been established. And what came next would no longer be shaped by assumption or reaction, but by what had been clearly seen. And in that clarity, there was no uncertainty left about where this would lead. The room remained still, but it was no longer the kind of stillness that came from uncertainty. It was the kind that followed clarity, the kind that settled in after everything had been seen for what it truly was. Ava Reynolds did not move immediately. She allowed the moment to breathe, to exist fully, because this was where everything converged, not in noise, not in reaction, but in understanding. Daniel Brooks sat across from her, his posture no longer rigid, no longer defensive, but quieter now, grounded in something he had not carried into that room earlier. Awareness. It was not sudden. It had not arrived all at once. It had built, piece by piece, through every question, every pause, every moment where silence had said more than words ever could. Ava's hands rested calmly on the file, her presence steady, unchanged, as if she had never needed to raise her voice to hold the room, because she had always carried something stronger than volume. She lifted her gaze once more, meeting his, not as an opponent, not as someone to overcome, but as someone who had now seen what needed to be seen. "The purpose of this court," she said quietly, her voice even, grounded, "is not to overpower, but to understand." The words were simple, but they carried the weight of everything that had unfolded. Brooks did not respond right away. He did not look away either. He held that gaze not out of resistance, but because stepping away from it now would mean stepping away from the truth he had just begun to recognize. Ava continued, her tone unchanged, her words measured. "Authority without reflection," she said, "creates distance." The sentence settled into the room, clear and undeniable. "But authority with understanding," she added, "creates trust." No one moved. No one spoke. The distinction did not need explanation. It was already understood. Brooks inhaled slowly, the breath deeper than before, as if something within him had shifted into place. Not completely, not perfectly, but enough to change how he sat in that room. Enough to change how he listened. Ava gave a small nod, not as approval, but as acknowledgement of the moment itself. Then she closed the file completely, the sound soft, final, marking the end of what needed to be said. "This review will continue," she stated, her voice steady, not as a warning, but as a fact. "But what matters now is what has already been made clear." The words lingered not as pressure, but as direction. Brooks lowered his gaze briefly, then lifted it again, not searching, not defending, but absorbing. Around them, the room remained quiet, but it was no longer passive. It was present, aware, carrying the weight of what had just taken place. Ava leaned back slightly, her posture still composed, her presence still centered, but the moment had shifted again, not toward conflict, but toward resolution. And in that final stillness, one truth stood above everything else, clear, steady, and impossible to ignore. He thought he understood power when he walked into that room. But what he learned was that real power does not need to raise its voice. It simply waits until the truth speaks for it.